what we're going to be going over here is direct labor variance analysis, and we're going to be looking at it in terms of a graph or a graphical approach to determine these variances. So when we're talking about variances, this is really where we're looking at we compare the actual results for the period here to the budgeted performance. Okay, so what we're going to do here for a variance analysis, we really have three different amounts or three different budgets that we'd be looking at here. So first, at the beginning of the period, we're going to establish some static budget here or standard amount that we allowed for our product here. In this case, it's going to be, we're looking at the direct labor, and it'll be coming off to some master budget. And then at the end of the period, we're going to know our actual results for the period. And then based on our actual results and our static or our standard amount that we've budgeted, we can determine our flexible budgeted amounts. Okay, so let's first look at this static budget, and that we establish here at the beginning of the period. This is where we're going to take these budgeted quantity. In this case, we're dealing with direct labor times some budgeted price for the direct labor. So budgeted quantity times some budgeted price, that is our static budget that we set up here at the beginning of the period. Then at the end of the period, this is where we know our actual results for the period. So this is the case where you're going to take the actual quantity of direct labor, in this case here, an hourly basis, times some actual price on an hourly basis. So the actual quantity times some actual price, that equals our actual results for the period. And that we know at the end of the period. Okay, so now we know our actual results and our standard or our static budget. Now this is where we can determine our flexible budget. And that's simply taking the actual quantity here that we had for the period here from our actual results and taking it times the budgeted price. And the budgeted price is coming off our static budget. So flexible budget, taking the actual quantity based on our actual results times our budgeted price coming off our static or standard amount. Okay, so let's go, and this is the case here. Now we know our actual results, our flexible amount here, and our static amount. We're going to be comparing the variances between those amounts. So for our direct labor, for our actual amount, that would be taking the actual hours used here in direct labor for the period times the actual rate. There would be some actual hourly rate here or price that we're paying for this direct labor. So that's for our actual results. Then for our flexible amount, that would be the actual hours used coming off our actual results for the period times the budgeted rate coming off our static budget or our standard amount. So actual hours used times the budgeted rate. And for our static amount, this is where we're going to have established the budgeted hours allowed for our product here for our direct labor times the budgeted rate or the budgeted hourly cost for our direct labor. So we have two different variances that we have to deal with. We're going to have our rate or price variance and our efficiency variance. So first for our rate or price variance, that's where we're just comparing our actual results versus our flexible budgeted amount. So I got everything color coded here, and you can see how we deal with this here. So I'm going to fact what is common here between our actual and our flexible amounts. Well, it would be the actual hours used here shown in green. So that would be the common amount. So the variance is really the difference between our actual rate here and our budgeted rate. So difference between actual rate minus your budgeted rate, or that difference times the actual hours used. Actual hours used was the common factor between the actual and flexible amount. Okay, so that's for our rate or price variance. And again, you can see why it's rate or price, because it's based on the difference here between the rate. And then we have our efficiency variance. That's simply the difference between our flexible amount and our static amount. And you can see here, again, what is the common factor here between the flexible and static amount? It's that budgeted hourly rate or the budgeted rate. So again, difference, it's the actual hours used here minus comparing your actual hours used to the budgeted hours allowed here. Okay, that difference times the budgeted rate here is the efficiency variance. So you can see the efficiency variance is based on the hours that are used versus the hours that were allocated or allowed here for our direct labor here for our production. Okay, so now let's go down and let's look at our graph here. Okay, so this is our graph. I got it laid along our x-axis here is really our direct labor hours here, and then along our y-axis up here is the direct labor cost. And then the other thing we have here in our graph, everything's built around this flexible budget here. And that's really taking the budgeted hourly rate here times the direct labor hours. So the green line here, it represents our flexible budgeted amounts here. And the slope here of our green line, or the change of x over change of y, is really the budgeted rate here. Budgeted rate, hourly rate times the direct labor hours used. Okay, so really we're only dealing with 2 points here on the graph when we're talking about our direct labor here. We're going to have some budgeted hourly budgeted hours allowed here. And again, this is on our direct labor hours here versus the actual hours used. So let's just look at this budgeted hours allowed here. So the budgeted hours allowed here, move up to your your flexible budget line here, and then you move across here to the y-axis. That's simply taking the budgeted rate times the budgeted hours allowed. And where are we getting that? Move up here, that's coming off our static budget. All right, so we've got that. Now, taking our actual hours used on our direct labor hours, you move that up to your green line here, to your flexible budget amount here, and then you move over to your y-axis here. That's going to be the budgeted rate times the actual hours used. So where is that coming from? That's coming from our flexible budget up here. And then for the other amount that we have here is it's not on the line, because this case, when we're looking at our actual results, our actual rate here is different from our budgeted rate. So based on that price, or that rate price here, it's not on the line here. So that's the actual cost, and that's taking your actual rate times the actual hours used here. That's coming off our actual amount. Again, just remember here, I'm showing it as unfavorable or a higher rate, but this actual rate here could actually be below the line here, but I'm just showing it just to go through our example to understand what's going on. The only point is here, when we're looking at this point, it's the actual rate here is different from the budgeted rate, so it's not on our flexible budget line or green line here. Okay, so if we've got our actual amount here, our flexible amount here, and our budgeted amount here for our direct labor costs. So now just looking at our the variances here, taking them off our graph here. So the budgeted rate times the budgeted hours allocated or allowed here versus our actual hours used versus our actual rate times the actual hour used is our total variance. And you can go back up here to look at that here on our chart here. So that's really looking at our actual versus our static amount here. And then we'll look at this direct labor rate variance here, and that's simply the difference between our budgeted rate times the actual hours used versus our actual rate times the actual hours used here. And that's really looking at, going up to our chart here, that's really our actual versus our flexible amount here. And that is called the direct labor rate variance. You see that on our graph here. And then to deal with the last, our direct labor efficiency variance, that's simply taking the budgeted rate times the budgeted hours allowed versus the budgeted rate times the actual hours allowed. So that difference here is our efficiency variance, and you can see that up here. The flexible budget was that budgeted rate times the actual hours used times the budgeted rate versus our static amount budgeted hours are allocated or allowed here times the budgeted rate. So that's our efficiency variance. So you see how they match up here on our calculations or our charts here versus our graph here. All right, just so you understand, in this case, our actual cost here was different because the actual rate here was different from the budgeted rate. It didn't end up on the line. But just understand how you lay it out in a graph form here. And then the other point is, when we're talking about favorable and unfavorable variances here, if we look at it in terms of our budgeted hours allowed here, if we use more than our budgeted hours allowed, it's going to be an unfavorable variance, and it's going to fall up on our line here. So you can see here, all these variances here would be unfavorable because they're above the budgeted hours allowed times some budgeted rate here. So that would be unfavorable. Anything favorable in this, when we talk about favorable, that's good. That's helping our bottom line or our income here. That is anything below, either on or below the budgeted hours allowed here. So that would be favorable variances, and that would be anything below our budgeted rate times our budgeted hours allowed for our direct labor costs here. Okay, so we've laid it out in our graph form here. Okay, just so you understand, we had our flexible budget, we had that budgeted hours allowed, actual hours used here, and it all fall out on our line here. That would be a different flexible budget. So just take whatever hours you have here, direct labor hours, move it up to your line and move it across here. That's based on the fact using the budgeted rate or the budgeted hourly rate here. Now, if anything is not on your budgeted hourly rate, then you'd have to determine exactly where your actual rate is, and then you can go and determine the actual hours used in that to determine any actual costs and looking at our variances. But nonetheless, the direct labor rate variance was the difference between our flexible and our actual amounts, and a direct labor efficiency variance was the difference between our flexible and our static amounts or our standard amounts allowed. Okay, so that's our graph. Now we'll go up here and let's look at one other thing here. So if we just look at the flow here, just to understand our flow, when we talk about those actual costs, that would be some wages payable that we have here for our direct labor, and then they would flow into some manufacturing payroll account here. That would be some control account, and then they would flow into some work in process here. Work in process comes at the budgeted cost. What payable is at the actual cost. Work in process, it comes in the budgeted cost, and then I've just got it laid out here, what we've gone through on our charts here. Actual cost was the actual hours used times some actual rate. Control account here, that was really that flexible budget amount. That was actual hours used times some budgeted rate. Actual hours from our wages payable, budgeted rate from our work in process control account here. And then the budgeted cost that goes into the work in process, so your budget hours allowed here times the budgeted rate. And just to understand the variances, they really happen between the payroll account here and the work in process, because that's, you have to know the actual hours used here. So just looking at it again, our rate or price variance was the difference between the actual hours, actual rate, excuse me, versus the budgeted rate on an hourly basis times the actual hours used. And then our efficiency variance was just the difference between the actual hours here and our budgeted hours allowed here times the budgeted rate. So you see how we did that. So that was our efficiency variance. And then one just last thing here, this key that we went through here, just as a reference key if you go back through it, the actual rate AR here was the actually hourly rate or price that we're paying here, actual rate for our direct labor. And then the BR here was the budgeted hourly rate. That's what we budgeted for the period here on an hourly basis. And then AHU here in green, that's the actual hours that we used. BHA here was the budgeted hours allowed. Okay, so that'll take care of our rate or price variances versus our efficiency variances here for direct labor.